The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The G7 leading industrial nations have agreed to cut greenhouse gases by phasing out the use of fossil fuels by the end of the century, according to a statement from German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The G7 group is, so the 7 countries that make up the G7 are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. This is being called historic by some environmental campaigners. Angela Merkel said the leaders have committed themselves to the need to, quote, decarbonize the global economy in the course of this century. They also agreed on a global target for limiting the rise in average global temperatures to a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. Everybody knows, Lewis, that I have been saying for years we need to get off of fossil fuels. But does it seem that historic to say by the end of this century, when our great-great-grandchildren are in charge, they will finalize getting ourselves off of fossil fuels?
Yeah, 85 years. It seems like we could do it quicker than that if we really wanted to. And I mean, the sooner the better. We're destroying the planet.
And I'm not being unreasonable in the sense that I know these things take time, it moves slowly, but let's at least do something in the next 3 years to really make a change. The more complex a system, obviously, the harder it is to change. Consider when the Constitution was written, how easy it was to do, versus if we were to now recreate the Constitution, how much more complex it would be based on hundreds of years of governance and being a country and living under that Constitution. That doesn't mean, by the way, that the Constitution couldn't or shouldn't be amended, but merely to use a sort of analogy. I get that this is slow moving, but I was sort of laughing to myself saying, is this different than the G7 saying, we have finalized an agreement where we will build a colony on Mars by the year 2300. At what point is it so far ahead that we can't really say it's that historic? It's more just someone saying we would like to do this.
That's what they're saying. They would like to do this. This is in no way law, right? I mean, who's going to be punished if this doesn't happen by the end of the century?
Well, they are sort of agreeing to relatively binding initiatives that are that can be. Oh,
please! You don't even believe it yourself.
I'm having a hard time with it. Yeah, let me put it a different way. Is this better than saying we don't give two whatevers when we get off of fossil fuels? I guess it's better than that.
It's I guess it's important to deliver the message. It is important to let the world know that this is important and that we need to try and do something about it, but it needs to be quicker than that.
We're going to follow up on this because you might hear me saying this and saying, well, David, you have no idea what we could actually do now to go in that direction. There was just a really interesting report put out by a number of scientists, which outlines exactly what we could start doing today to go in this direction. I haven't reviewed it yet. I have it bookmarked to take a look at later today or tomorrow, and we'll follow up and we'll come back, Lewis, and I will say, hey, here are some examples of what could be done now instead of the G7 saying, hey, everybody, big news, our great-great-grandchildren are going to be encouraged by something we're going to leave in writing to get us off of fossil fuels in 85 years.
Yeah, it can happen sooner, and I don't think it's that complicated. I mean, a lot of this is common sense stuff.
I got a very, very disturbing story sent to me by Ryan Conway about Kansas Governor Sam Brownback, who has signed a bill that threatens the entire state of Kansas's judiciary with essentially total destruction if it rules against a law that Governor Sam Brownback favors. And we've talked about the disaster of Sam Brownback's Kansas. We've talked about the tax cuts for the rich and how they now can't even afford education and all sorts of welfare programs. It's just Kansas is all blown up. It's an absolute disaster, embarrassment, what Sam Brownback has done. Here's the backstory on this. In 2014, the state Supreme Court in Kansas ruled that the disparity between the funding that schools in rich districts receive versus the poor districts violates the state constitution. It's too unequal. So the justices in the state Supreme Court told the legislature, you have to fix this problem. And soon after that, the legislature passed an administrative law that stripped the Supreme Court of its authority to appoint local chief judges and set district court budgets. It was essentially retaliation. It was like a childish retaliation against what's supposed to be an independent judiciary for doing something that the Kansas administration, the legislature, did not like. The law was, in case the court didn't get the message as a result of that law, Sam Brownback and the legislature have now also threatened the justices with blatantly political reforms, like subjecting them to recall elections, dividing the court into two, lowering the retirement age, and putting in partisan elections for the court. And now the court is going to have an opportunity to strike down the administrative law, which, again, probably violates the state constitution. And that's where Sam Brownback's insane new law comes in. The law declares that if the Supreme Court strikes down the administrative law with regard to the school funding, the entire state judiciary will lose its funding. Brownback and the legislature are essentially bullying the judiciary, holding it hostage, saying, uphold our law or you no longer have the money to exist. And Ryan wrote to me saying, that is a blatant example of how checks and balances are not something that is valued by the Tea Party types. They have an ideology that they want implemented regardless of laws. I had a different reaction, which is that these right-wingers, Tea Party affiliated or the constitutional conservatives, whoever, they claim to be all about the Constitution. They fetishize, they worship the Constitution, yet they're threatening to destroy checks and balances that are such an important part of what the framework is that this country was built on if the supposedly independent judiciary doesn't decide in your favor. They don't really care about the Constitution and checks and balances.
I think Brownback probably only cares about what he wants to care about. I mean, he's the governor. He's in charge. He says, whatever he says is the law. That's the reality he wants. This reminds me a lot of what's going on with Rick Perry right now and what he is under investigation for. It was a very similar thing.
Yeah, and this just generally shows us the true nature of conservative Republicans and their desire for authoritarian rule when it comes to fixing things they don't like, right? Small government conservatives stay out of people's bedrooms. We don't tell people what to do in their homes or what guns they have. Oh, but the types of sex that they can have, yeah, we need to be very, very involved in that. It's that same double standard. And meanwhile, they criticize President Obama for using executive orders because it's unconstitutional. They don't even seem to understand the reality of that. And by the way, where were they when all of the recent Republican presidents were using way more executive orders than Obama? It's just hypocrisy after double standard after hypocrisy.
Imagine the number of executive orders that someone like Rick Perry or Brownback would use in office.
I've received a really interesting story from Victor about Bernie Sanders, and we've talked about Bernie Sanders being widely ignored by corporate media. We've talked about Bernie Sanders drawing huge crowds, surging in the polls, doing really well as far as fundraising goes, but he still is trailing Hillary Clinton. And one of the sort of underlying stories in the Bernie Sanders campaign that isn't getting that much attention is that Bernie Sanders is really not doing too well with minority voters. Bernie Sanders is doing really well within the Democratic Party with white voters, but the non-white voters are not that thrilled with Bernie Sanders. I'll give you the numbers and then we'll talk about maybe what's going on. There's a new Washington Post ABC News survey. 56% of white Democrats back Clinton and 14% support Sanders. Among non-white Democrats, Hillary Clinton has 72% support, which is about 16 points higher than among white Democrats, whereas Bernie Sanders has only 5% non-white Democratic support, 9 percentage points fewer than from white Democrats. So the numbers seem to suggest this is a real thing, Lewis.
It's yeah, of course. It seems like it's a real thing.
Wall Street Journal NBC News polling shows that 68% of non-white Democrats say Hillary Clinton doesn't even need a primary challenger, while the majority of white Democrats want her to face other candidates. And among white Democrats, 56% say Hillary Clinton will bring real change, compared to a whopping 81% of non-white Democrats who really think Hillary Clinton will bring real change. So there's a few different things that could be going on here. Number one, it may just be that Hillary Clinton is a known entity. Her connection to Bill Clinton and her work as senator in New York and Secretary of State simply has her more on the radar of non-white voters. This is a possibility, although we would need to explain why it is that non-white voters disproportionately have an awareness of Hillary Clinton relative to Bernie Sanders. The other issue may be that Bernie Sanders has not actually been very vocal about the fact that, hey, he has a 93% rating on civil rights from the ACLU. Bernie Sanders is focusing on so many issues that disproportionately impact minority communities, including the wealth gap, including being on the receiving end of the destruction of our environment. And there are so many issues where Bernie Sanders may not be couching the discussion with regard to non-white voters, and he could be, and maybe it's a matter of waiting until we get to the debates for that to happen. I don't honestly know what is behind these numbers.
My guess would be it would be the first thing you said, that Hillary is just a known entity, and Bernie Sanders has been hiding away. I shouldn't say hiding away, but in the Northeast for quite some time, and I think a lot of white people don't know who Bernie Sanders is.
We need to remember, though, that he is going to, at some point, need to really get on the radar of minority voters if he hopes to win, because more than 40% of the people who voted for President Obama in 2012 were ethnic minorities in some way, shape, or form, and black voters are sometimes the majority in Democratic primaries in southern states. So that is going to be, he's going to need to address this at some point. The question is, will merely debating and getting out there be enough to address it? I don't know the answer.
Hard to say. I hope he's got some great people running his campaign, but the debates are going to be huge, no doubt about that.
Let's take a break. Send us your thoughts on this to our Twitter account, twitter.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
As you may know, our program depends on funding from our audience to exist through the membership program. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up. Lewis, it's incredible. We're almost now getting more story suggestions for the bonus show than we do for the regular show, because people just really like hearing us sort of shoot the breeze more casually on the bonus show about their stories. The number of stories I get emailed every single day for the bonus show is incredible.
That's a good thing. It means I don't have to search as hard, and I'm covering a story that someone already I know wants to hear. So it works out perfectly.
The bonus show is just one of many member benefits that you can sign up for. Today's new member of the day is Joe Marshall. Thanks, Joe, for being a David Pakman Show member. I think Joe, short for Joanna there, not Joseph. davidpakman.com/membership is the place to sign up. It is Tuesday, and we're getting into election season, so we're doing Election Tuesday 2016. When we have new candidates, we discuss who we would vote for. We certainly have new candidates right now. On the Democratic side, we have Lincoln Chafee, former Rhode Island governor, running for president. We have Hillary Clinton. We have Martin O'Malley, former Maryland governor. And we have, of course, independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. On the Republican side, we now have Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, Carly Fiorina, Lindsey Graham, Mike Huckabee, George Pataki, Rand Paul, Rick Perry, Marco Rubio, and Rick Santorum makes 10. So let's go first to the easy question, Lewis. Out of all these candidates, who would you like to see be the next president of the United States?
Still, without a doubt, I don't even have to think about it. It's Bernie Sanders.
All right. I agree. Absolutely. Bernie Sanders. Now let's go to the next question. And this is where I think things are going to get mixed up today. If you knew that it was going to be a Republican, which Republican would you rather see be president? Your last answer a couple weeks ago was Rand Paul.
I think now this came up. The George Pataki thing came up. And some people seem to think that he is a level-headed guy. But I really just, I still think nobody really knows anything about this guy. So I say it's between Rand Paul and George Pataki, but because I haven't really heard much from George Pataki yet, I think I have to stick with Rand Paul.
I am switching from Rand Paul to George Pataki. If I knew it was going to be a Republican as the next president from the current slate of 10 Republican candidates, it would be George Pataki. I looked up what his most recent positions have been, because as we know, with what happened with Jeb Bush, it can change pretty quickly. But George Pataki wants to use ground troops against ISIS. That I don't agree with. He has, as governor of New York State, he passed bills to curb greenhouse gas emissions, although he wants to see the private market do most of the climate change mitigation. He favors a pathway to legal status for undocumented immigrants already in the country. He signed a gay rights bill as governor and says that the Republican Party should really not be focusing on same-sex marriage. He would, unfortunately, want to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which is just absolutely ludicrous. And he also supports starting from scratch with the tax code, which is usually code for let's make sure the rich are paying a lower tax rate. But I have to tell you, on balance, I think that George Pataki is the most reasonable guy in terms of demeanor and positions and just overall. And I think if I knew it was going to be a Republican winning, I would vote for George Pataki.
But like you said, with Jeb Bush, things could change very quickly. And once he starts talking and doing the interviews, we'll see. He could just end up being another Jeb Bush. All
right. And from all of the candidates currently running, Lewis, who would you be most scared to see as president?
I think that would probably be, it's between Ben Carson, Rick Perry, and Santorum. If I had to pick one of those guys, I mean, Ben Carson's the craziest. Rick Perry's the most incompetent, and Santorum just seems to be the most disturbed. It's tough.
I would go with Santorum. Right now, I think I would be most freaked out by Santorum, followed by a tie between Ben Carson and Rick Perry. And then after that, maybe it'd be Huckabee after that. Although Huckabee is up there, you know, between transgender jokes and selling quack cancer cures on his email list. He's certainly a guy that's freaking me out.
I think we can all be very thankful that none of those candidates that we just mentioned have a chance.
Let's talk about the latest with our Indiegogo campaign. You know, we're coming across soon in a couple of months on the 10-year anniversary of the David Pakman Show. And after a lot of discussion over the last 6, but even really more like 12 to 14 months, Lewis and I decided it's time to see how far we can take this thing. We are going to try to scale the show up in a faster way. The program will be moving to Boston, Massachusetts in the fall, where we will hopefully be hiring producer Lewis full-time. We will also be bringing on an additional co-host to produce additional content and do investigative journalism and so many other things. And we're trying to raise $50,000 in 50 days. We are on day 9, and we have raised $18,142 from 187 different donors. So the target for midnight tonight, I don't care about the money. The target is 200 donors. Even if you just donate $1, help us get to 200 donors, which would already be more than halfway to the most donors we've ever had in one of these campaigns before, only 9 days in. That's only 13 more donors, Lewis. If 13 people donate even just $1, we will get there today.
That seems reasonable to me. I think that's a great goal for today. Yeah.
And we've gotten a lot of small contributions. You know, people like Kim Jong-un and P.F. Chang's have donated very, very small amounts. People really enjoying, seemingly, donating money under very odd and clearly fake names. I don't care what name you donate under. If you're a contributor, if you're voting with your dollars and helping to fund the show, by all means, have at it.
Yeah, have fun. You can. Are you allowed to use profane names to donate?
I don't know what would happen. I don't know if the Indiegogo system would flag that in some way, but it may be worth trying if you're throwing in your $5 or $10 or $2, whatever it is. Most popular perk so far: David Pakman Show t-shirts made from 100% recycled materials. Just about every campaign we've done, those are one of the most popular items. The hoodies, which are incredibly soft, also very, very popular. And the bumper stickers, which I have here in both colors, the black logo and the white logo. These are always very, very popular. And then also a lot of people opting for the handwritten thank you postcard that I will write to you, thanking you for your support. Any perk that you like or no perk at all, it is all available. Go to davidpakman.com and click on the Indiegogo banner on the right side of the page. I hope to have good news tomorrow about our 200 contributor goal. It has been a long time since we talked about Glenn Beck. Last week, Glenn Beck announced he would be making a major announcement about some new campaign, saying he thinks his entire life has led to this point. We've heard this type of hyperbole from Glenn Beck before, haven't we?
Pretty much all the time. He is a master at saying nonsensical things like this that really get his audience fired up.
So Glenn Beck did eventually make the announcement, but what I'm going to play for you is just 40 seconds from a basically half-hour rant that he went on, comparing himself in a completely self-aggrandizing way to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I mean, it was just a bizarre, never-ending rant. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I don't know about you, but I can no longer, nor will I any longer, pretend that nothing is wrong and act as though things are normal and what we're experiencing in our country is progress. It's not progress, it's madness. When America, the last bastion of freedom, the best hope of mankind, becomes a place where her citizens turn their eyes from crucifixions of children, we are no longer a country that I recognize. We are no longer a people that I recognize. We are no longer a nation in which I care to call myself a member of.
That's right, Lewis. Glenn Beck saying, we are no longer a nation in which I care to call myself a member of. I just love it. What on earth does that mean, Lewis?
Well, it's a strange way to say it, but I think we know what he's saying. And to him, I would say, first of all, this is kind of shocking to hear from someone who is so ultra bleeding heart American, right?
Yeah, isn't this anti-American? I thought that the right was supposed to be angry with people who said, I'm embarrassed to be an American. And with, albeit with very unusual grammar, Glenn Beck is essentially saying the same thing.
Yeah, so it's kind of confusing. I'm not sure how his audience is reacting to this, but I wouldn't expect to hear this from him. Usually it's the, we need to take the government back type of thing, not I need to get out of here.
Lewis, you know that when right-wingers say they're embarrassed to be Americans or they don't want to be anymore, it's patriotic because they're fighting back against the liberal lack of patriotism. If a liberal says they're embarrassed to be American, they're being unpatriotic because they're not supporting their country.
Yeah, that's usually how it goes. And they're both saying the same thing for completely opposite reasons.
And just so, in case you care, what Beck officially announced was the start of a Never Again Is Now campaign to bring awareness to what's going on in the Middle East, people displaced and threatened by ISIS. And he's going to be promoting this by doing a speaking tour of churches. So I look forward to that. How does Glenn Beck even have time for this project? I thought he was hard at work building that Independence Park libertarian utopia thing.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I guess if he's got enough money, he can just throw it wherever he needs to and let the money work for him.
Incredible. Just absolutely stunning. Next, Robert Greenwald will join us to talk about his new documentary film, which really addresses the persecution and prosecution of whistleblowers. Really look forward to speaking with him next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's a pleasure to be joined today by Robert Greenwald, who's the director of the new documentary film War on Whistleblowers, Free Press and the National Security State. It's been very interesting, Robert, to follow what has been going on with leakers and whistleblowers over the last decade or so. How did you first get interested in this topic?
We first got interested in this at Brave New Films because of the stories in the press that several years ago started to talk more and more about the whistleblowers who were being persecuted and prosecuted by the Obama administration. And when I started to look into the articles, what became very clear was that if in fact these whistleblowers were silenced, the press would lose an enormous source of important information, contacts, and stories. One thing we know for clear about the military-industrial congressional complex is they do not give up information. The way that information comes about is through whistleblowers who then go to the press. And the notion that this entire source of information was going to be stopped, was going to be prevented from coming to us, seemed both anti-democratic and the kind of story that lent itself to film, the personal story of these courageous whistleblowers.
And talk to us a little bit about the sort of multi-pronged approach that we've seen at silencing whistleblowers, because it's dealt not only with the whistleblowers or would-be whistleblowers themselves, but also with the press.
Yes, and that's the most important part in some ways, because they can silence a whistleblower, but if they silence a whistleblower and they silence the press, then we have a real problem. So what we did as we researched and talked to the different whistleblowers, every single one of them said that they first tried going through channels, they had zero success, and then they reached out to somebody in the press. And there are some wonderful, important, serious investigative journalists. And we were able to first interview the whistleblowers and then interview who in the press they reached out to, and who in the press the Obama administration and the Attorney General were attempting to silence, so that people could see and experience very clearly, oh, that article I read by Jane Mayer, that wouldn't have happened without this whistleblower. Or that story by Dana Priest in the Washington Post, that wouldn't have happened without this whistleblower, and on and on and on.
And it's been the Espionage Act of 1917 that's been sort of used as the framework by much of the Obama administration's prosecution or persecution, as the case may be, of whistleblowers. Talk to us about the complexities of that, because on the one hand, we know that it's been sort of raised from the dead and all of a sudden there's increased usage of that Espionage Act, but at the same time, it is part of the law, so shouldn't we really be focusing on maybe addressing what the law is?
Well, yes, it's part of the law, but I do not believe that when the Espionage Act was created, any human being thought that this would be used 60, 70, 80, 90 years later to persecute and prosecute people who were speaking up, who were trying to save democracy, people who not only were not committing espionage, but in fact were so profoundly committed to the values of democracy, to the values of our country, that they were willing to risk careers and future employment and financial security for their family for one reason, and one reason only. And that was a very, very strong moral compass that said, this is wrong, what's being done is wrong, and my country needs to know about it. The absolute antithesis of espionage in every shape and form.
Let's talk a little bit about what you sort of alluded to there, which is the morality of this and the moral compass element. I'm curious, now that you've spent a long time looking into this, whether you think there should be a distinction made or whether we should differentiate between whistleblowers and leakers. And by that I mean those who are exposing crimes and those who are exposing things or activity that, while they may be morally reprehensible, they may not necessarily be against the law. And the reason I ask this is not because I also didn't think that what Edward Snowden, for example, exposed was incredibly valuable, and it was sort of irrelevant that it was not against the law because of how we knew that it had been made legal, and that was so concerning. From the point of view of addressing how an administration should be dealing with this, is it important to differentiate between a leaker and a whistleblower?
Well, it's an interesting question, and depending on your definition, of course, the devil's in the details here, but leakers generally are people in DC at higher levels who frankly are leaking for self-aggrandizement or to enhance their internal battle with some other division of the government, or who are trying to protect themselves from the long arm of history and what it's going to say about them. They are not people who are providing information in an effort to correct policy. And that's what the whistleblowers are doing. They're giving us information so that policy can and should change. The leaker is saying, hey, I want to look better, so I'm going to tell this reporter what I said in a meeting at the White House that really is not supposed to be talked about. And that's a significant dichotomy. It also, by the way, raises the issue of who's being punished and who's not being punished. Over and over again, middle and lower level people who are whistleblowers are having the book thrown at them, and the highest level members of the government who are leaking information that is classified, there has been zero consequences.
Let's explore that a little more. I mean, I would be super interested to hear about your take then on Chelsea Manning's situation as compared to that of Edward Snowden, right? Chelsea Manning exposing crimes that had taken place. Edward Snowden exposing activity that was very unsavory to many of us. It exposed that these data collection techniques did not indeed have the sort of protective effect that we were led to believe by members of government, but they were not illegal by statute, although we got into this conversation of, well, how did this get passed? Is there a big difference there in these two cases for you?
Well, I studied the Snowden case pretty carefully, and actually we, as you know, have an interview with Snowden in the War on Whistleblowers film. Right. And I think what's very clear with Snowden is that he is an amazing patriot who we all owe an enormous debt of gratitude to. What he's exposed, what he's brought forth, what he has said, and what he has risked has been very, very important. With Manning, in a way, that was the first step, or the first major step. If you look at these things historically, as we do a little bit in the film, you know, you start with Ellsberg, and then you see all the current people, and then we didn't get to do all of this. There's Manning, and then you have Snowden. You can look at it historically as a continuum. You can look at it as one leads to another, to another. And that old saying, it takes a village, you know, so in this case, it does take a village to create change. And I would argue each and every one of these folks, Manning, Snowden, Ellsberg, and the others that you see in the film, are really important to fundamentally, again, challenging the incredible power of the military, industrial, and congressional complex, bipartisan, that works together, that every single day limits the information we get and limits, therefore, our ability to make decisions about who we want representing us and who we want implementing policy, because we don't get the information we need to make those decisions.
Last thing I want to touch on in the limited time we have many political issues in this country where there's a stark difference, by and large, between Democrats and Republicans. For example, abortion, for example, gay rights. On many other issues, there is a very small or no difference at all between Republicans and Democrats. With the issue of persecution of whistleblowers, is there a partisan element to this, or is this really something that is equally concerning on both sides of the aisle?
Based on the behavior of the Obama administration, we have to say it's a problem on both sides of the aisle. There are more individuals who are progressive Democrats who are taking this on, but you also have some libertarians who are, some of them tend to be Republicans, who are taking the issue on. So the consensus to silence, shut up, and punish whistleblowers is bipartisan, and the opposition has been more led by progressive Democrats or progressives in general, but there are some libertarians and Republicans who are joining the battle. And one of the most important things I think all of us can do and should do is we really need to look at the issues. And we try to do that at Brave New Films over and over again, whether it's whistleblowers or drones or whatever the issue, and say, what is the policy we believe in? What can help us make the kind of country we want to have? What are the values we need to protect and defend? And who do we have to name?
I'll remind everybody we've been speaking with Robert Greenwald, director of the new documentary War on Whistleblowers, Free Press, and the National Security State. Such an important issue, and I really appreciate you being on with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and I appreciate that you're showing the film and making it available to a larger audience. And for those who are interested, we have a Brave New Educators program where they can get the film and screen it. We've had over 1,000 screenings of all our films in universities and high schools with teaching guides. So there are many ways that you can do something or organize a screening in your church or union or workplace.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
So there were a whole bunch of headlines over the last few days that an FDA committee has approved what is being called female Viagra, recommended for approval by an 18-6 vote by an advisory committee. It will now actually move towards the broader FDA. The drug is called flibanserin. I think that's how it's pronounced. It's for the treatment of hypoactive sexual desire disorder in premenopausal women. And the FDA typically follows the recommendations of these advisories committees, but they are not required to do so. Dr. Marjorie Gass, a sexual dysfunction expert, said, "I am elated, very happy to hear this. I think women are going to be very appreciative of having something they can try for this problem." It's really unclear whether female Viagra is a good nickname for this, because Viagra does not affect sexual desire in men. It just helps with the mechanics of sex, if that makes sense, Lewis, right? Blood flow is boosted to the genital region. This new drug for women, flibanserin, is designed to alter brain chemistry over time to help increase sex drive. It's not at all like Viagra. It doesn't cause an immediate physical change in the body, and you have to take it over a long period of time versus taking Viagra when you want to have your mechanics improved. So I think that it's a very deceptive way that it's being written about by a lot of media. Female Viagra is a sort of deceptive name.
Well, I don't know if this is the fault of the media. Did the company say that this was the female version of Viagra in an attempt to, just have successful marketing off the Viagra name? Perhaps the media is just a victim of that. But either way, yes, it really is not a good comparison.
What we do know is that these daily pills are huge money makers for insurance for pharmaceutical companies. Anytime you can get someone on a pill where you say, hey, you should really take this indefinitely to solve whatever issue you're having, those are often the really big money makers for people, for pharmaceutical companies to have people on. And that is a very significant difference in this new drug, flibanserin, compared to something like Viagra or Cialis. Although now there is a Cialis for daily use, which is a sort of brilliant marketing ploy, which is, listen, rather than just trying to time out when you might want to have sex and taking something like Cialis or Viagra, take a low-dose Cialis constantly so you'll sort of always be ready. That's a great way to sell more pills.
It really is. I don't know if this stuff works at all, but it's a moneymaker. And don't worry, soon enough we'll see something very similar coming out of India for a fraction of the cost.
Interesting article in the New York Times by Seth Stevens-Davidowitz, and it talks about differences between red and blue states, but not when it comes to religion, not when it comes to habits of fast food consumption or whatever else. It talks about how blue states are far more likely to use therapy to treat mental illness. In blue states, there are 54% more Google searches for psychotherapists, which is a broad category that includes searching for find a therapist or counseling or cognitive therapy, than there are in red states. According to an analysis done of data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are also 76% more psychologists or psychiatrists per capita in blue states. And the author of this New York Times article says that it's also not true that people in blue states are more neurotic or depressed. So one explanation would be, no. It's not that the blue states are more likely to treat these conditions with therapy. It's that blue states are more likely to have people suffering from these conditions, but that is actually not true. People in red and blue states, roughly speaking, are equally likely to be on antidepressants. So why the specific difference in therapy? Cost. Cost certainly could play a role. Red states on average have lower incomes. Smaller percentage of the populations are covered by insurance. A lot of there's more of red states that are rural relative to blue states, which means there are fewer therapists maybe in your community. But that's not the whole story, because searches for lots of other expensive procedures like LASIK, for example, or plastic surgery or chiropractic care aren't different in blue states to red states. So there is a difference. And one idea is that there could be stigma, right? 30% of Americans who now have mental health problems but are not seeking treatment say it's because of the stigma associated with these conditions. It's much easier if you can't sleep to go to your regular doctor and get sleeping pills than actually work through what may be the underlying causes of anxiety that's keeping you up at night with a mental health professional. And this seems to be a huge red-blue divide. The states with the most interest in finding therapists, where the population is finding therapists, are Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, California, Maine, Colorado, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Maryland, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., Washington State, Oregon, Pennsylvania, mostly blue states. The states least interested in finding mental health counselors or professionals are South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, Mississippi, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Alabama, Montana, Arkansas, Ohio, South Carolina, Louisiana. So what this leads us to ask is the stigma against therapy higher in red states? And it appears that there is. According to Google AdWords, men in red states make up a smaller portion of visits to therapy-related websites. Americans in blue states are about 100% more likely to tweet about therapy or their therapist. And we also have data from Alcoholics Anonymous, which while and AA is actually even a religious organization, but still we see that blue states have much more prevalence of people availing themselves of AA services than in red states. So Lewis, I think stigma is a huge factor here.
That has to be it. I don't think it has really anything to do with money. Maybe a little bit, but it's definitely the stigma. Unfortunately, it seems like people are just too proud, too ashamed, too embarrassed to admit that there might be something wrong.
And even when we look at why we should care about this from a fiscal perspective, remember that we know that therapy is much more effective than antidepressants for treating depression, for example. Compared with blue states, red states have significantly higher suicide rates. Therapy would not prevent every suicide, but of course, regular counseling when someone is in distress or otherwise needing that sort of outlet could certainly prevent some of them. So we should all care about this, and we should be aware of this going forward. One of the an additional difference between red and blue states that we should be aware of. Our phone number, if you want to call anytime, is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail related to what we talked about earlier, the G7 countries saying we're going to get rid of fossil fuels 85 years from now.
So the big G7 announcement is we're going to be totally not using fossil fuels by 2100. Coincidentally, that's about when we're going to run out of fossil fuels. So what's the big deal announcement?
Yeah, that's very clever. So we thought, yeah, our great-great-grandchildren are going to fix this. So, but the other way to look at it is we're going to stop using fossil fuels as soon as they're completely unavailable. On today's bonus show, a grim situation in Eritrea. I think that's the way it's pronounced. We'll talk about that. Water theft in California, and 100-year-old relics found in an Oklahoma school. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up for the bonus show. Don't miss it. Lewis is the host. I'm the sidekick.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.